Sometimes the worst mistakes happen when we think we're doing the right thing. Sheriff Raymond Pike told himself he pulled the trigger to protect his town. He told himself it was his duty. But the man weeping over the dying dog wasn't a threat. He wasn't a danger at all. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he was a quiet war hero. And the dog, Duke, was his last and only friend in a world that had forgotten them both. The town of Dry Hollow was about to face a choice between pride and doing what's right. Because when the wronged man won't raise a hand for revenge, sometimes the hardest fight is the one with yourself. What happens when forgiveness is harder to find than a bullet? The morning sun cast long, hungry shadows across Dry Hollow's main street. It was a town caught between yesterday and tomorrow. The old frontier was dying, and the railroad was bringing in a new world, a world most folks here weren't sure they wanted any part of. Wooden sidewalks still groaned under dusty boots, but now, newly installed telegraph poles stood like skinny ghosts, promising a connection to a life that felt a million miles away. Sheriff Raymond Pike had walked this same dusty route every single morning for 20 years. His boots knew the rhythm of the boards. Duty. Routine. At 53, he stood ramrod straight, a man who'd never had to question his place in the world. The silver badge on his chest, passed down from his father, was the only law this town had ever really needed. His father had told him that badge meant making the hard choices, the ones that let decent people sleep sound at night. And for 20 years, Pike had made them. The town trusted him. Mrs. Patterson at the general store had his coffee ready at 7 sharp, black as sin and strong enough to wake a dead man. Doc Henley would nod from his porch, a curl of pipe smoke his morning greeting. The town ran on the quiet respect everyone had for Sheriff Pike. But lately, that respect felt heavy. The pressures were mounting. Cattle rustlers, bolder than ever, were hitting ranches just a day's ride from town. Drifters were pouring in off the new railroad line, their eyes empty and their intentions questionable. Pike had seen what happened to towns when the law went soft. It rotted from the inside out. He wouldn't let that happen to Dry Hollow. Not on his watch. Just 3 miles east, where the creek bent through a grove of cottonwoods, Thomas Ashford started his own day. At 41, he had a quiet strength you only get from surviving things that would break other men. His small cabin was neat, his garden tidy. He was a man who understood the value of making things grow in hard ground. Duke, a massive German shepherd with eyes like amber, was always at his side. The dog walked with a slight limp, an old injury that never quite healed right, but his loyalty to the quiet, bearded man was absolute. They had seen hell together, these two, and they had walked out of it side by side. Hidden in a wooden box under Thomas's bed was a Congressional Medal of Honor. It was wrapped in an old shirt that still smelled faintly of gunpowder. He'd earned it leading a cavalry charge so desperate, so suicidal, that it had saved an entire unit. The papers back east had called him a hero. But Thomas knew the truth. The real heroes were the ones who never came home. He was just the one who was too stubborn to die. Duke had been there that day. He was a military dog, trained to find the wounded on the battlefield. While Thomas was rallying what was left of his men, Duke had moved through the chaos, his nose to the ground, sniffing for life. He found 6 men that day. 6 men who would have bled out and died if not for that dog. Duke took shrapnel in his hip during the fight, but he never stopped working. Not until every last man was found. They retired together, man and dog. 2 veterans looking for a little bit of peace. Dry Hollow was supposed to be that place. Far enough away from the world to let a man's soul heal. Thomas worked his small ranch, kept to himself, and avoided the attention that came with a reputation like his. The medal stayed in the box. It felt more like a tombstone than an honor. The folks in town knew bits and pieces of his story. Doc Henley, who'd been an Army medic himself, recognized the look in Thomas's eyes. The 1,000-yard stare of a man still fighting a war on the inside. Rachel Morrison, the school teacher, remembered Thomas from before. Before the war, he'd been a young man full of dreams. He came back. Different. Older than his years. Duke was his anchor. The dog understood the silences that fell over Thomas, understood the nightmares that still woke him in a cold sweat. In those moments, Duke would lay his big head on Thomas's chest, a warm, living weight that reminded him he wasn't alone in the dark. That morning, as Pike walked his beat and Thomas mended a fence, neither man knew their paths were about to cross in the worst way imaginable. The town hummed along, same as always. Shopkeepers opened their doors, kids walked to school. A perfect ordinary day. Pike stopped at the telegraph office. "Anything from the marshal?" he asked the young operator Jimmy. The lack of leads on the rustlers was gnawing at him. "Nothing yet, Sheriff," Jimmy said. "But Millerville got hit again. Another dozen head of cattle gone." Pike's jaw clenched. Millerville was getting closer. The noose was tightening. Every stolen cow, every nervous rancher felt like a personal failure. Out at the ranch, Thomas worked on a broken fence post. Duke lay in the shade, his ears twitching, scanning the countryside. His training never left him. He was always on patrol. But here, the only real threat was a rattlesnake sunning on a rock. Thomas thought he'd found peace, or something close to it. He'd look out at Dry Hollow in the distance and feel a sense of calm. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Sheriff Pike had been watching him. The quiet man who kept to himself. The big, watchful dog. In Pike's anxious mind, a man who wanted to be left alone was a man with something to hide. His fear for the town was starting to poison the way he saw everything. The man who kept the peace and the man who had fought for it were on a collision course, and neither of them could see it coming. It all started with a simple trip to town. Salt, coffee, ammunition. Thomas loaded the wagon, and Duke hopped onto the seat beside him, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the wood. It was a routine they'd done 100 times. They reached the edge of town around noon. Kids waved from their yards. Thomas touched the brim of his hat but didn't smile. He'd forgotten how. As they neared the main street, Duke started acting strange. His ears flattened. He whined, a low, nervous sound that Thomas hadn't heard in years. Thomas trusted that dog's instincts more than his own. Duke's senses had kept them both alive when the world was on fire. "What is it, boy?" Thomas murmured. His own senses went on high alert. Something was wrong. Sheriff Pike's morning had gone from bad to worse. The new telegram confirmed it. The rustlers had hit a ranch just 30 miles south. They were circling Dry Hollow like vultures. Mayor Walsh had cornered him, his voice smooth but his message clear. The town was scared, and they were looking to Pike to do something. The unspoken threat hung in the air. "If you can't keep us safe, we'll find someone who can." Pike's authority, the foundation of his entire life, felt like it was cracking. And that's when he saw it. Thomas Ashford's wagon pulling up to the general store. The quiet man. The man who kept to himself. The man with the big, watchful dog. Pike's tired, anxious mind started connecting dots that weren't there. A loner. A stranger, really. And a dog that looked like it could tear a man apart. Thomas tied the reins and Duke jumped down, stretching his legs. Mrs. Patterson came out of the store, a warm smile on her face. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ashford. I've got that coffee you like." Thomas was reaching for his shopping list when Duke suddenly went rigid. The dog's lips pulled back from his teeth. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. A silent alarm that Thomas knew meant one thing: danger. Duke had smelled something that triggered years of training on the battlefield. But from across the street, Sheriff Pike saw something else entirely. He saw a vicious animal about to attack. He saw innocent people in danger. His hand went to his gun, the weight of his father's badge pressing on his heart. "That dog looks like trouble," Pike thought, his fear twisting into a dangerous certainty. He'd seen good dogs go bad. He thought he was saving his town. Duke wasn't getting ready to attack. He was getting ready to protect. He had scented a threat in the crowd, a danger no one else could see, and his training was screaming at him to shield his partner. But Pike was already moving. He couldn't see the difference between a dog preparing to attack and a dog preparing to defend. "Hey!" Pike's voice cracked across the street like a whip. "Control that animal!" Thomas looked up, confused. Duke was tense, yes, but he was sitting calmly at his side. "Sheriff, there's no problem here," Thomas said, his voice even. "He's just—" But Pike wasn't listening. He was crossing the street, his hand on the butt of his pistol, his face a grim mask of resolve. The townsfolk scattered, sensing the violence about to erupt. "I said, control that dog!" Pike yelled, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "Look at him! He's about to attack!" Thomas looked down at his friend, his partner. He saw only loyalty. "Sheriff, please!" Thomas begged, raising his hands. "He's not aggressive. He's just—" The sound of the hammer being cocked cut through the air. Pike's gun was out, steady, aimed right at Duke's chest. The world stopped. "Don't!" Thomas screamed. The gunshot echoed off the storefronts, a single deafening crack that silenced the world. Duke's body jerked. He crumpled to the ground, a dark pool of blood spreading in the dust beneath him. Thomas fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he gathered his friend into his lap. Duke's amber eyes looked up at him, full of the same trust they'd always held, even as the life faded from them. "No, no, no," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "Duke, stay with me, boy. Stay with me." The crowd stood in stunned silence. Mrs. Patterson had a hand clamped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Doc Henley pushed through, but it was too late. He knew it the second he saw the wound. Sheriff Pike stood there, gun still in hand, his face pale but his expression stubborn. "The animal was dangerous," he announced to the silent street. "I had to act." But even as he said the words, he saw the doubt in their eyes. He saw the gentle way Thomas cradled the dying dog, and a cold, hard knot of dread began to form in his stomach. Duke's breathing stopped. Thomas knelt in the dust, holding his friend, and the silence that fell over Dry Hollow was heavier than any accusation. The badge on Sheriff Pike's chest had never felt so heavy. It felt like a stone, dragging him down into the dark. The silence on Main Street was a living thing. It was thick with judgment. Doc Henley finally knelt beside Thomas, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Thomas didn't look up. He just kept stroking Duke's fur. When he finally raised his eyes, the pain in them was so deep, so raw, that people in the crowd had to look away. This wasn't just a man losing a pet. This was a soldier losing the last member of his unit. Sheriff Pike finally holstered his gun. The click echoed in the unnatural quiet. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "The animal showed clear signs of aggression," he said again, but his voice was thin. It lacked the conviction he so desperately needed. That's when Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her apron stained with tears. "Sheriff Pike," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "that dog has never been anything but gentle. Never." A murmur went through the crowd. They all knew Duke. They knew Thomas. And they knew what they had just seen was wrong. Terribly wrong. The skepticism was a physical force, pressing in on Pike from all sides. Thomas finally got to his feet. He lifted Duke's body into his arms as if he weighed nothing. The big man's face was a mask of dust and tears, but his voice was steady. "I'll be taking him home now." He walked to his wagon and gently laid his friend in the back, among the sacks of coffee and salt that no longer mattered. As the wagon rolled slowly out of town, Sheriff Pike found himself standing utterly alone in a circle of cold, unforgiving eyes. The authority he had built over 20 years had just vanished. It was gone, like a puff of smoke in the wind. That night, Pike sat in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The day replayed in his mind, over and over. Had the dog really been aggressive? Or had his own fear, his own paranoia about the rustlers, made him see a monster where there was only a loyal friend? Doc Henley walked in without knocking. "Raymond," he said, his voice hard. "We need to talk." Pike looked up. In 30 years, the doc had never used that tone with him. "This isn't just about today," Doc said, his eyes scanning Pike's face like he was diagnosing a sickness. "You've been drinking too much, sleeping too little. You're seeing shadows everywhere. This town didn't elect a scared man to be its sheriff." The truth of it hit Pike like a punch. "I did what I had to do," he said, but the words were hollow. "Raymond, I was an army medic," Doc said, leaning forward. "I know what a trained war dog looks like, and I know what an aggressive dog looks like. The animal you shot today was not a threat." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Pike wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the disappointment in his old friend's eyes crushed the fight out of him. "You don't understand the pressure," Pike whispered. "The rustlers, the town." "I understand more than you think," Doc cut him off. "But it doesn't change what you did. A good man lost his best friend because you let your fear pull the trigger." After Doc left, Pike sat in the dark. The silver badge felt like it was burning a hole in his chest. He had spent his whole life being the protector. What happens when the protector becomes the danger? Miles away, Thomas knelt by a fresh grave on a hill overlooking the valley. He held Duke's worn leather collar in his hands. The metal tags were cool against his skin. "Duke, 7th Cavalry. You were the best of us, old friend," he whispered to the darkness. "The very best." The peaceful night sounds of the country surrounded him, but for Thomas, peace felt a million miles away. It had died in the dust of Main Street. And back in Dry Hollow, behind closed doors, people were talking. They were asking questions. Had the man they trusted to keep them safe become the biggest threat of all? The seeds of doubt had been planted. And in the dark, they were starting to grow. Word of the shooting spread through town like a fever. It reached Rachel Morrison, the school teacher, as she was grading papers by lamplight. The mayor's son, Tommy, burst into her little house, his eyes wide with a horror he couldn't comprehend. "Miss Morrison! Sheriff Pike shot Mr. Ashford's dog. He shot him dead for no reason." Rachel's heart stopped. She had known Thomas before the war. He had been sweet and shy and had courted her with wildflowers and nervous smiles. He'd been full of life. The war had stolen that from him. The man who came back was a ghost, haunted by things he would never speak of. She had tried to reach him, but he had built a wall around his heart, a wall too high for anyone to climb. But she knew about Duke. Thomas had written to her once from the front. A single letter, not about the fighting, but about a remarkable dog who was saving lives. A dog he was proud of. Duke wasn't just a pet. He was Thomas's link to the world, the only living thing that could still make him smile. To lose that dog would be like losing a part of his own soul. To lose him like this. It was unthinkable. The next morning she baked bread and made a pot of his favorite beef stew. She packed it all in a basket and hitched up her buggy. It was a small gesture, but it was all she had. She found him on his porch, staring out at nothing. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw her, just for a second, she saw a flicker of the boy she used to know. "Rachel," he said, standing out of pure habit. "This isn't a good time." "There's never a good time for this," she said gently, setting the basket down. "But you don't have to face it alone." He took the basket, his eyes avoiding hers. "Thank you," he mumbled. I'm not much company. I remember when you got Duke, she said quietly. You wrote to me. You were so proud of him. The mention of the letter seemed to break something inside him. His shoulders slumped. He was more than just a dog, Rachel, he said, his voice thick. He saved my life. He saved other men's lives. Good men. Men who got to go home to their families because Duke wouldn't give up on them. Rachel moved closer, her heart aching for him. Tell me about him, she whispered. Tell me everything. And for the first time since he came home, Thomas Ashford started to talk. He talked about Duke's training, his bravery under fire. He told her about the day they both became heroes, when Duke had pulled 6 wounded soldiers from a field of death. They put a medal on my chest, Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. But Duke was the real hero. I just tried to keep up. As he spoke, the wall around his heart began to crumble, just a little. Duke's death had ripped open old wounds, but it had also shown Rachel that the gentle man she once loved was still in there, buried under all that pain. Back in town, Sheriff Pike was feeling the walls close in. The whispers had turned to open questions. Mayor Walsh called an emergency town council meeting. Pike wasn't invited. The meeting was held in the back room of the general store. The voices were heated. He's been drinking, said Harvey Thornton, the banker. My wife saw him stumbling out of the saloon last week. And that poor dog, Mrs. Patterson added, her voice sharp with anger. Sheriff Pike saw what his fear wanted him to see, not what was really there. Now, let's not be hasty, the mayor cautioned, trying to keep the peace. Raymond has served this town for 20 years. It was one mistake. One mistake? Doc Henley's voice cut through the room. That wasn't a mistake, Harold. That was a man ruled by paranoia. What happens next time? What if next time it's not a dog he sees as a threat? What if it's one of us? The question hung in the smoke-filled room like a guillotine. Pike's 2 decades of service were turning to dust before his very eyes. A single, terrible decision was about to cost him everything. That night, Thomas and Rachel sat on his porch under a blanket of stars. He wasn't alone with his grief anymore. Her presence was a small, warm light in his suffocating darkness. What happens now, Thomas? She asked softly. He was quiet for a long time. The night sounds of the prairie filled the silence. I don't know, Rachel, he said finally. For the first time in my life, I honestly don't know. But as he said it, he looked at her, and for the first time since Duke's death, a tiny flicker of something other than pain sparked in his eyes. It was a new beginning, born from a terrible end. 3 days later, Thomas carved a simple cross from a piece of weathered oak. He worked slowly, the feel of the knife in his hands a small comfort. He carved one word into the wood. Duke. He placed the cross at the head of the grave on the hill. He thought it would be a private place. A place for him to grieve alone. He was wrong. Word spread through Dry Hollow. It started with Rachel telling Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson told Doc Henley. Soon, the whole town knew. A few days later, Thomas found a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the cross. The next day, a small, smooth stone appeared, with Duke's name painted on it in careful letters. Then, a little paper bag with a handful of dog biscuits inside. A note was attached. It just said, "For a good dog." Thomas stood there, holding the note, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. He had pushed the world away for so long, he had forgotten that people could be kind. The town was reaching out, not just to mourn his dog, but to apologize for what their sheriff had done. Sheriff Pike, on the other hand, was becoming a ghost in his own town. He still walked his beat, but people looked through him. Conversations stopped when he got close. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, silent judgment. The isolation was a poison, eating him from the inside out. He hadn't realized how much he needed the town's respect until it was gone. From a hill outside of town, he watched through his spyglass as people made the trip to Thomas's ranch. He saw them leave their small gifts at the grave. He felt a bitter mix of guilt and envy. That dog was more loved in death than he was in life. And then, the rustlers struck again. John Brennan rode into town, his face a thundercloud. They'd hit his ranch. In broad daylight, 40 head of his best cattle, gone. He found Pike in his office, staring into a cold cup of coffee. "They hit us, Sheriff," Brennan said, his voice flat. He didn't have to say anything else. The accusation was clear in his eyes. "You should have stopped this." "How many riders?" Pike asked, his voice sounding rusty. "At least 6, maybe more. They knew what they were doing," Brennan said. He paused, looking Pike up and down. "I'm putting together a posse. We need every gun we can get." The way he said need made it clear he had zero confidence in Pike's ability to handle it alone. Pike nodded, his mind numb. "I'll deputize 6 men. We ride at dawn." 7, Brennan corrected him. "Thomas Ashford's already agreed to come. He knows tracking better than anyone in this territory." The words hit Pike like a physical blow. Thomas Ashford, the man whose life he had shattered, was going to ride with him. It was a chance for redemption, maybe, but it was also terrifying. He would have to face the man he'd wronged, ride beside him, and depend on him. Pike knew Brennan was right. Thomas had learned things in the war, things about hunting men, that no one else knew. If they had any chance of catching these rustlers, they needed him. The posse gathered in the gray light of dawn. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other men, Brennan, Doc Henley, a few ranch hands, they all looked to Thomas. They treated Pike with a cold, formal respect, but it was clear who they trusted. Thomas rode up on a strong bay horse, his face unreadable. He nodded once at Pike. No anger, no forgiveness, nothing. "The trail leads south-southeast," Thomas said to the group, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority. "They're pushing the herd hard. They're either very confident or very desperate." Pike found himself listening like a rookie deputy. The roles were completely reversed. The quiet hermit was now the leader. And the sheriff was just a man with a tarnished badge, following his lead. As they rode out, Pike watched Thomas. He saw the focused, competent soldier he must have been, but he also saw the deep well of pain in his eyes. Every time their gazes met, it was a fresh reminder of Pike's failure. The trail led them into the Badlands, a harsh, unforgiving country of rock and scrub. This was a land that didn't forgive mistakes. Thomas rode at the head of the group, his eyes scanning the ground. He saw things no one else did. A broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, tiny clues that told him the story of the rustler's passage. Pike watched, a knot of shame and awe tightening in his gut. This was the man whose best friend he had killed. And now, the lives of everyone in the posse, including his own, were in Thomas's hands. He was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about Thomas's skill. It was about his character, his willingness to help the very town that had let him down so badly. It was a lesson in grace. And Pike wasn't sure he was worthy of it. The posse rode for 2 days, deep into the Badlands. The trail was getting colder, and the men were getting restless. It was Thomas who kept them going, his focus absolute, his calm unshakable. He was a man in his element, a hunter on the trail. On the 3rd day, they found them. The rustlers were camped in a narrow, hidden canyon. They were careless, confident they hadn't been followed. Thomas laid out the plan with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned officer. There was no question of who was in charge. Pike listened, took his orders, and tried not to think about the irony of it all. He was taking orders from the man whose dog he'd shot, a man he had judged as a threat. The fight was short and brutal. The rustlers were surprised, but they were desperate. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls. In the chaos, one of the rustlers broke free and made a run for it, straight at Pike. The sheriff raised his pistol, but his hands were shaking. The memory of shooting Duke flashed in his mind. He hesitated. Just for a second. But a second was all it took. The rustler leveled his rifle. Pike saw the flash from the barrel. He knew he was dead. But then another shot rang out. A shot from his left. The rustler crumpled to the ground, his own shot going wide. Pike looked over. Thomas was there, his rifle still smoking, his face calm and steady. He had just saved Pike's life. The silence in the canyon was deafening. The other rustlers were captured, the cattle secured, but all Pike could see was Thomas, lowering his rifle. Thomas Ashford had just saved the life of the man who had destroyed his. The ride back to Dry Hollow was quiet. The posse was victorious, but the mood was somber. They had recovered the cattle and captured 4 of the 6 thieves. But something had fundamentally shifted. Pike was no longer just the sheriff who had made a terrible mistake. He was the sheriff whose life had been saved by the man he had wronged. The debt he owed Thomas Ashford was now immeasurable. That night, Pike sat in his office, a bottle of whiskey and a piece of paper in front of him. His hands still shook, but for a different reason now. He had to write a letter. He had to find the words. But how do you apologize for something so monumental? How do you thank a man for saving your life when you're the reason his is in pieces? He wrote, "Dear Mr. Ashford." He crumpled it up. He tried again. Thomas. Too familiar. He threw it away. Finally, he just wrote the truth. I know words can't bring Duke back. I know an apology can't fix what I did. But I need you to know that I have carried the weight of my mistake every second of every day. I was afraid. I was afraid of failing this town, of not being the man my father was. And my fear made me kill an innocent creature, your friend. And then you saved my life. I don't know how to live with that. The letter lay on his desk, stained with whiskey and tears. He had no idea if he would ever have the courage to send it. Meanwhile, Thomas was starting to heal, in ways he never expected. Helping the town, using the skills he thought he'd buried forever, had woken something up inside him. People started coming to him for help. A lost calf, a dispute over a fence line. He was becoming a part of the community, not by choice, but by necessity. Rachel's visits became his new routine. She brought food, but she also brought conversation. She slowly, patiently, chipped away at the wall around his heart. One evening, she found him on the porch, tooling a piece of leather. It was a dog collar. Small, beautifully made. Sized for a dog that was gone forever. "What are you making?" she asked gently. "Something to remember him by," he said, his voice quiet. "His collar is buried with him. I needed something to hold on to." "He meant everything to you," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain that was years old. "After the war," he began, his voice raspy, "I couldn't connect with people anymore. It felt like I was watching the world through a pane of thick glass. But Duke." He understood the silence. He didn't need words. He just stayed with me. He waited for me to find my way back. "And did you?" she asked softly. He looked at the unfinished collar in his hands. He looked at the empty space on the porch where his friend should have been. Then he looked at her. "I thought so," he said. "But now, I don't know." Duke's death had shattered his fragile peace, but Rachel's kindness was starting to show him that maybe, just maybe, he could build a new one. But the biggest twist in this story was yet to come. And it was hidden in a place no one would have ever thought to look. Rachel was helping Thomas clean out a dusty old trunk one afternoon. It was full of his old army things. Uniforms, canteens, and at the very bottom, a worn leather journal. She wasn't trying to pry, but as she lifted it out, it fell open. Tucked inside was a faded photograph, The picture changed everything. It showed a much younger Thomas, his face hard and lean, in his cavalry uniform. He was standing with his unit. And sitting right in the front, as proud and official as any soldier, was Duke. He was wearing a special harness, one with military markings and ribbons pinned to it. Duke wasn't just Thomas's pet who had followed him to war. He was a soldier, an official, decorated member of the United States Army. Beneath the photo, in Thomas's neat handwriting, was a caption: Duke and the men of the 7th Cavalry after the Battle of Copper Ridge. 12 lives saved by one dog's courage. When Thomas walked back in and saw her holding the photograph, he just sighed. He had kept it a secret, not out of shame, but because explaining it meant talking about the war. And he never talked about the war. He was more than just your friend, wasn't he? Rachel whispered, her mind reeling. Thomas sat down heavily, the weight of the past settling over him. He was a certified medical service dog, he said, his voice thick with memory. Trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. He could tell the living from the dead by scent alone. He saved more men than any medal could ever account for. He told her the whole story. How Duke was the best of the best, chosen for his intelligence and his unflinching courage under fire. How after the war, the Army was going to retire him to a civilian family, and Thomas had pulled every string he had, called in every favor, to adopt him himself. He'd earned the right to a peaceful retirement, Thomas said, with someone who understood him. Rachel looked at the photo again. Sheriff Pike hadn't just killed a dog. He had killed a decorated war hero. The tragedy was 100 times worse than she had imagined. But then, a new thought chilled her to the bone. Pike's guilt was already destroying him. If he found this out, it would break him completely. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Thomas stared at the photograph of his friend. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants the whole world to know who Duke was, but another part worries this truth will kill a man who's already dying." 3 days later, the choice was taken from him. Doc Henley rode out to the ranch at a full gallop, his face pale. "It's Pike," he said, breathless. "He broke into your cabin last night, Thomas. He stole your war journal. I found him this morning in his office, unconscious. Bottle of laudanum next to him. He'd been reading it. He knows." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Pike knew. He had found out the worst possible way. Alone, drunk, drowning in a guilt that had just become unbearable. "Is he alive?" Thomas asked. "Physically, yes," Doc said, shaking his head. "But mentally, he's broken, Thomas. He just keeps mumbling about medals and heroes. He's asking for you. He says he has to make it right." When Thomas walked into the clinic, he found a ghost. Pike was propped up in bed, his skin gray, his eyes hollow. When he saw Thomas, they filled with a despair so profound it was hard to look at. "I didn't know," Pike whispered, his voice a dry rattle. "I swear to God, I didn't know he was a hero. I killed a hero, Thomas. I killed the best of you all." Thomas pulled up a chair. He felt a strange mix of pity and anger. "You couldn't have known," he said. "I never told anyone." "But I should have looked!" Pike cried, tears streaming down his face. "I should have asked. I let my fear make me a monster." He looked at Thomas, his eyes begging for something. For condemnation, for hatred, for anything but the quiet compassion he saw on Thomas's face. "How can you not hate me?" Pike choked out. "I took everything from you." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned forward. "Because hating you won't bring him back," he said, his voice soft but strong. "And I've seen enough hate to last a lifetime. I know it only destroys the man who carries it. Duke wouldn't want me to live like that. He would want me to heal." In that small, quiet room, An impossible conversation began. Pike confessed his fears, his pride, the crushing weight of his father's legacy. Thomas listened, and for the first time, he understood. Pike wasn't a monster. He was just a man, a flawed, frightened man who had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. When Mayor Walsh arrived to demand Pike's resignation, he found the two men talking quietly. In that moment, seeing the broken sheriff and the grieving soldier finding common ground, Thomas made a decision. A decision that would change Dry Hollow forever. "Mayor," Thomas said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "I think it's time this town heard the whole truth. All of it." The story of Duke, the war hero, hit Dry Hollow like a lightning strike. The town had mourned a pet. Now they were mourning a soldier. Pike's mistake was no longer just a tragedy. It was a desecration. And the weight of that knowledge finally crushed what was left of Sheriff Pike's spirit. 3 nights later, he sat alone in his house, his father's old service revolver on the table in front of him. The lamplight gleamed on the polished steel. The letter to Thomas was still there, unfinished. Useless. What good were words now? He had killed a hero who had saved 12 men. There was no coming back from that. His hand shook as he reached for the gun. It felt cold. Final. One pull of the trigger, and the guilt would be gone. The shame would be over. His father had taught him to take responsibility for his mistakes, and this mistake was too big to live with. Just as his fingers closed around the grip, there was a knock at his door. "Sheriff Pike, it's Thomas Ashford. We need to talk." Pike froze. The one man in the world he couldn't face was on his porch. He shoved the gun into his lap, a guilty secret, and opened the door. Thomas stood there, his face grim in the moonlight. "May I come in?" They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence stretching between them. Thomas's eyes missed nothing. The empty bottles, the unwashed clothes, the look of a man at the absolute end of his rope. "I know what you were thinking of doing with that gun," Thomas said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "Doc told me what he found. The laudanum. The journal." Pike's hand tightened on the revolver in his lap. "You don't understand." "I understand better than you think," Thomas said, his voice firm but gentle. "After I came home from the war, I spent 6 months with a loaded pistol on my nightstand. Every night I thought about how easy it would be to just make the nightmares stop." Pike looked up, shocked. He saw his own despair reflected in the other man's eyes. "The difference," Thomas continued, "is that my demons were my own. But you're carrying the weight of what you did to someone else, to Duke." That was all it took. The dam inside Pike broke. He sobbed, a storm of guilt and shame pouring out of him. "I killed him, Thomas! I killed a hero because I was too proud and too scared. He saved all those men and I killed him." Thomas let him cry. He waited until the storm passed, and then he spoke. "Duke's death was a tragedy," he said. "But your death won't fix it. It will just create another one. It will waste another life." "I have no life left," Pike whispered. "You have this town," Thomas said, his voice suddenly sharp. "The people who have depended on you for 20 years. You have a chance to honor Duke's memory. Not by dying in shame, but by living a life of service. The kind of service he represented." They talked all night. 2 broken soldiers, sharing truths they had never spoken aloud to anyone. Thomas told him about his own survivor's guilt, about the crushing weight of being called a hero. Pike talked about his father, about his fear of never measuring up. "The night before the big battle," Thomas said, his eyes distant. "The one where Duke earned his ribbons. I was going to desert. I couldn't face it anymore. But Duke, he wouldn't leave my side. He knew. And when the attack came, I fought because of him. Because if that dog could be that brave, How could I be any less? He looked Pike straight in the eye. He saved my life that day, not just on the battlefield, but in my own soul. His death doesn't have to be the end of the story, Pike. It can be the beginning. It can teach us both how to keep going when all seems lost. As the sun began to rise, Pike pushed the gun away. He picked up a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. He wasn't writing a suicide note anymore. He was writing a confession. He wrote a letter to the citizens of Dry Hollow. It was a brutal, honest accounting of his failure. He confessed his fear, his pride, and the tragic mistake it had led to. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for a chance to earn back their trust, a chance to become the kind of man Duke would have been proud of. When he was done, he showed it to Thomas. The act of writing it, of facing the truth without excuse, had already started to heal something in him. He knew he had to face the town. He had to read it to them. As they walked toward the town square together, two men bound by a tragedy, Pike knew this was the hardest thing he would ever do. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't walking alone. The memorial service for Duke was held on a crisp Sunday morning. The whole town was there. They gathered around the simple wooden cross on the hill. Thomas had never wanted this. He had wanted to grieve in private. But Duke's story was the town's story now. Thomas stood by the grave, his old dress uniform on, the Medal of Honor pinned to his chest for the first time in years. Rachel stood beside him, her hand in his. Mayor Walsh spoke. Doc Henley read from the Bible. But then, the moment came. Sheriff Pike stepped forward. He looked older, thinner. The confidence was gone, replaced by a deep, painful humility. He held his letter in a trembling hand. I stand before you today not as your sheriff, but as a man asking for forgiveness, he began, his voice clear and steady. When I shot and killed Duke, I did not just kill a dog. I killed a hero who saved 12 American soldiers. I killed him because I was afraid, and there is no excuse for that. He told them everything. The details of Duke's service, the valor, the lives saved. He laid his own soul bare for the town to see. He confessed his paranoia, his pride, his failure. When he finished, he unpinned his badge. He held it out to the mayor. I hereby resign my position as sheriff of Dry Hollow. I am not worthy to wear this badge. The crowd was silent. The mayor reached for the badge, but then Thomas stepped forward. Sheriff Pike, he said, his voice ringing out across the quiet hillside. Duke wouldn't want your career to end in shame. He would want it to continue with wisdom. Pike stared at him, his mouth open. I've served with men who made mistakes under pressure, Thomas continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls, it's whether he gets back up. What the sheriff did today. Confessing his failure to all of you. That took a courage Duke would have understood. Rachel stepped up beside Thomas. My students make mistakes every day, she said, her voice warm. What matters is what they learn. Sheriff Pike has learned a hard lesson, and he has shown us he has the character to grow from it. One by one, the townspeople began to speak. Mrs. Patterson, John Brennan, Doc Henley. They spoke of Pike's 20 years of service, of his kindnesses, of his dedication. They had not forgotten the good man he had been. Pike stood there, tears streaming down his face, as the town he thought he had lost wrapped its arms around him. Forgiveness isn't about what we deserve, Thomas said, his voice gentle. It's about what we choose to give. Duke saved lives because it was in his nature to help. The best way we can honor him is to do the same. In that moment, the town of Dry Hollow chose forgiveness. Mayor Walsh, seeing the tide turn, made a proposal. Pike would remain sheriff, but for the rest of his term, he would serve with a deputy chosen by the community, a steady hand to guide him. Everyone looked at Thomas. He just smiled and shook his head. I'm not a lawman, he said, but I know one. He recommended a young, level-headed veteran he had served with, a man named James Crawford, a man who understood the burdens of leadership. Pike agreed immediately. The idea of having a partner, of not having to carry the weight alone, was not a punishment. It was a lifeline. As the service ended, Thomas knelt by the grave and placed a small American flag next to the cross. "Rest easy, old friend," he whispered. "Your last mission was your most important one." 1 year later, a bronze statue of Duke stood in the center of the town square. It was a reminder, not of the tragedy, but of the redemption that had grown from it. The day of Thomas and Rachel's wedding, the whole town celebrated. Thomas stood at the altar in his old uniform, the medal on his chest no longer a burden, but a testament to a life of service. His best man was Deputy James Crawford. In the second row sat Sheriff Pike, a quieter, wiser man, the town's trust in him fully restored. When it came time for the rings, it was Pike who brought them forward, a symbol of the trust and healing that now bound all of them together. Later, at the celebration in the square, Thomas stood for a moment by the statue. Pike came and stood beside him. They looked at the bronze dog, a silent guardian watching over their town. "The governor is creating a new medal," Pike said quietly. "The Territorial Medal for Canine Valor. Duke's getting the first one." Thomas smiled. "He'd be more interested in trying to steal a piece of that wedding cake," he said. As Thomas and Rachel left for their honeymoon, the whole town cheering, Rachel looked back at the statue, glowing in the lantern light. "He's still watching over us," she whispered. Thomas took her hand. "Always," he said. "That's what heroes do." The wagon rolled into the dusk, toward a future they had built together from the ashes of grief. And behind them, the town of Dry Hollow rested in the peace they had all fought so hard to find. A peace born from a terrible mistake, and the courageous, beautiful act of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the stories we have coming up are ones you won't want to miss.